Have you ever wondered what happens when those meant to uphold the law become its greatest violators? When a racist cop slapped a black woman in a packed courtroom, he had no idea she was the judge. And in just 4 minutes, his entire empire began to crumble. Stay with us for a story of arrogance, injustice, and the kind of justice that doesn't whisper, it roars. This video takes you on Judge Eleanor Wright's journey as she exposes a corruption system spanning decades. You'll witness how one careless action toppled an entire power structure and uncover the dark secrets hidden within our justice system. This isn't just a story, it's a masterclass in the power of truth and the courage to stand against corruption. If this is your first time on our channel, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next shocking justice story. Each week, we bring you true accounts of those who dared to stand against corruption and make a difference. Now, let's dive into this incredible story. A single slap can sometimes change everything. Not just any slap, but one delivered with the arrogance that comes from years of unchecked power. When Officer Richard Kane struck a quiet black woman in a packed Charleston courtroom, he thought it was just another day, just another show of authority. What he didn't realize was that she wasn't a defendant or a witness or even a court clerk. She was Judge Eleanor Wright. And in the next 4 minutes, the empire of corruption he'd helped build would begin to crumble. This isn't a story about a slap. This is about what happens when systems of power, built over generations to protect themselves, suddenly face the one thing they never prepared for: accountability. It's about what happens when the shield of silence finally cracks. Charleston, North Carolina has always been a city of stark contrasts. Its cobblestone streets and antebellum architecture whisper stories of old-world grandeur, while carefully masking the deep tensions that run beneath the surface. It's a place where tradition and progress wage a constant battle, where the old guard holds tightly to power while change pushes relentlessly at the gates. For those willing to look closely, Charleston is actually 2 cities, one of pristine historic districts and tourist-filled markets, and another of systemic inequity, where justice often depends on who you know and what you look like. This duality has persisted for generations, maintained by those with every interest in keeping things exactly as they've always been. Judge Eleanor Wright understood this duality better than most. At 62, she carried the weight of being the first black female judge to sit on Charleston's highest bench with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Her silver-streaked hair was always pulled back in a precise bun, and her penetrating gaze missed nothing, especially not the subtle indignities people thought they could slip past her. Her path to the bench hadn't been easy. She'd spent 3 decades fighting within the system, first as a defense attorney championing clients who were often guilty of nothing more than being poor and black, then as a prosecutor determined to clean corruption from within, and finally as a judge who believed the law could be an instrument of genuine justice if applied fairly. Judge Wright knew the price of breaking ceilings. For years, she'd navigated the microaggressions, the doubts, the constant need to prove herself worthy of a position some still couldn't accept should belong to someone who looked like her. She'd persevered through it, all with a resolve that came from understanding that her role was bigger than herself. She was paving a way for others. What she didn't know was that on this particular morning, everything she'd built, everything she stood for, would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. The system she'd fought both against and within was about to reveal its true face. And Judge Eleanor Wright was about to discover just how deep the corruption in Charleston really went. The morning sun had barely climbed over the Atlantic horizon when Judge Wright pulled into her reserved parking space at the courthouse. The grand neoclassical building loomed before her, its columns stretching skyward like sentinels. To many, it was an imposing symbol of justice and order. To Wright, it was both workplace and battlefield, a place where the ideal of equal justice, constantly clashed with the reality of human prejudice. She stepped from her car, briefcase in hand, mind already cycling through the day's docket. It was supposed to be routine, an arraignment, a vandalism case, juvenile defendant. But something felt off. After 30 years in law, Wright had developed an intuition for trouble, and this morning it prickled at the back of her neck. "Morning, Judge Wright," nodded the security guard as she passed through the metal detector. He was one of the good ones, treated everyone with the same professional courtesy, regardless of title or appearance. "Morning, Dennis," she replied, her mind still nagging with unease. Outside her courtroom, her clerk met her with a strained smile. "Good morning, Judge. Officer Kane is already inside." Wright paused. "Kane?" "Yes, ma'am. Richard Kane, the arresting officer in the Thompson case. He's been insistent about being here." Judge Wright felt her jaw tighten involuntarily. Every person in Charleston's legal system knew Richard Kane, or at least knew of him. Mid-40s, clean-cut, third-generation law enforcement officer. He carried his family's legacy like a shield and his badge like a weapon. Over 15 years on the force, he'd accumulated more complaints than commendations, yet somehow they all disappeared into the administrative ether. Excessive force, harassment, racial profiling, all buried under a system designed to protect its own. "I see," Wright said simply, but her mind was already connecting dots. This was meant to be a straightforward juvenile arraignment. There was no need for the arresting officer to be present, let alone insistent. Wright entered the courtroom quietly. She hadn't donned her robes yet, hadn't assumed her position on the bench. To the casual observer, she was simply another professional black woman in a well-tailored suit, perhaps an attorney or court official. The courtroom was sparsely populated this early. A few attorneys shuffled papers at their tables. 2 officers stood at the back wall, chatting quietly. A handful of observers, including 2 journalists, sat scattered among the public benches. And there, at the prosecution table, stood Officer Richard Kane. He cut an imposing figure 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a military-straight posture and closely cropped hair graying at the temples. His uniform was immaculate, his expression sour. Beside him sat a thin, nervous-looking teenager with his public defender, a young man who looked overwhelmed before proceedings had even begun. Cain was speaking to the clerk's assistant, his voice carrying across the room. "Let's get this started. I've got actual crimes to deal with today, not babysitting some punk vandal." Wright moved toward the side table where case files were placed, intending to review them before taking the bench. Cain noticed her movement and frowned, clearly annoyed by the delay. "Excuse me," he called out. "You with the defense?" "We're trying to get moving here." Wright didn't respond immediately, instead opening the file before her. This apparently inflamed Cain's already obvious impatience. "Hey," he said, striding toward her. "I'm talking to you. You people need to learn some respect for procedure." The room seemed to still slightly at his tone and choice of words. One of the journalists looked up from her notebook. The public defender shifted uncomfortably. Wright turned to face Cain, her expression neutral, but her eyes direct. "Officer Kane, court will begin when?" It happened in an instant. Cain's hand flashed upward and outward, connecting with the left side of Judge Wright's face with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. Papers stopped rustling. A coffee cup froze midway to someone's lips. Even the overhead fluorescent lights seemed to flicker in shock. Wright didn't stagger, didn't raise her hand to the red mark blooming on her cheek, didn't shout or cry out. She simply stood there, her eyes locked on Cain's, watching as the momentary satisfaction on his face slowly transformed into confusion. You don't get to tell me how things work around here, Cain said, his voice slightly less certain now, sensing something in her composure that didn't fit his expectations. The courtroom remained frozen in tableau. Then Wright spoke, her voice calm but carrying an authority that needed no robe or gavel to convey. Is this how you treat officers of the court, Officer Kane? Cain blinked, confusion deepening. What are you talking about? Wright stepped past him, ascending the platform to the bench. She turned, facing the courtroom and Cain from her rightful position. For one endless moment, nobody breathed. Cain stood motionless, his expression cycling rapidly from confusion to disbelief to the first flickers of fear. One of the officers at the back of the room had gone pale, his hand moving unconsciously toward his colleague's arm in warning. The public defender's mouth had fallen slightly open. The teenage defendant was watching with wide, disbelieving eyes. Officer Richard Kane, Wright finally said, her voice crystal clear in the silence. Did you just strike me in this courtroom? Kane's tongue darted out to wet suddenly dry lips. I didn't know who you were. That is not what I asked, Wright replied, cutting through his stammered response. Did you or did you not just physically assault me? Yes or no? Kane's jaw worked silently. The reality of his situation was dawning on him with the slow-motion horror of a car crash. He just slapped a judge. Not just any judge, but Eleanor Wright, the most respected and powerful black woman in Charleston's judicial system. You came at me, he finally managed. You weren't in your robes. You thought I was beneath you, Wright finished for him. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of uncomfortable recognition through the room. Your only defense is ignorance and arrogance. Cain took a half step forward before catching himself, remembering where he was. He glanced toward the officers at the back of the room, seeking allies, but found none. No one would meet his eye. If I were a white male judge, Wright continued, her voice dropping to an even more penetrating register, would you have slapped me without knowing who I was? Cain said nothing, but his silence was deafening. I'll take that as a no, Wright said. Judge Wright's gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack that jolted the room back to life. Officer Martin, she addressed the bailiff, a steady veteran officer who'd served the court with discipline for over a decade. Please secure Officer Kane. He is not to leave this courtroom. Officer Martin moved without hesitation, taking position near Cain, whose face had flushed dark red. The officer didn't draw his weapon or reach for handcuffs. There was no need for such measures against a fellow officer, at least not yet, but his posture made it clear that Cain was now effectively detained. Miss Harper, Wright addressed her clerk. Please enter into the record that Officer Richard Kane has physically assaulted a sitting judge in open court, unprovoked and witnessed by. She quickly scanned the room. 11 individuals, including 2 members of the press. The clerk nodded, fingers already flying across her keyboard. Furthermore, Wright continued, please confirm for the record that this courtroom is under video surveillance. Yes, Your Honor, the clerk responded. 2 cameras, both operational. Cain's eyes flicked upward, locating the small red recording lights in the ceiling corners. His expression shifted again from anger to something closer to panic. Up until this moment, he'd operated in a world where his actions, however egregious, were inevitably swept away. Complaints disappeared. Witnesses recanted. Evidence went missing. The thin blue line held firm. But now he stood in a different reality, one where his actions had been captured, documented, witnessed by people beyond his reach. Your Honor, Cain started, a new strategy forming. This has been a serious misunderstanding. I was simply. Wright raised her hand, and he fell silent. Officer Kane, you've had 20 years of misunderstandings, haven't you? She reached for a folder on her bench. I have your service record here. 17 formal complaints, 5 internal affairs investigations, 2 civil lawsuits settled out of court. She looked up. And yet, somehow, no disciplinary action. Not once. Cain's jaw muscles worked visibly. I've spent my life, Wright continued, watching men like you mistake force for law, mistake fear for order, and mistake silence for consent. Her voice was level, but carried to every corner of the room. Not today. She straightened in her chair. In accordance with the authority vested in me as a circuit judge for the state of North Carolina, I hereby place Officer Richard Kane under formal judicial investigation for criminal assault on a public official. A gasp came from somewhere in the gallery. The journalists were scribbling frantically now, one openly recording with her phone. Cain seemed to sway slightly on his feet. You can't do this, he said, an edge of desperation in his voice. It was a mistake. I didn't even know who you were. And yet, Wright replied quietly, her gaze unwavering. You knew enough to hit me. The words hung in the air between them, a simple truth that cut through every excuse, every justification. In that moment, it wasn't about titles or robes or recognition. It was about the fundamental choice Cain had made, to use physical force against someone he perceived as powerless. Officer Martin, Wright instructed, please escort Officer Kane to Holding Room B. He is to remain there until representatives from Internal Affairs arrive. As Martin guided a stunned Cain toward the side exit, the prosecutor assigned to the vandalism case an older white man named William Peterson rose from his seat. Your Honor, regarding the Thompson arraignment. It will be rescheduled, Wright interrupted. The arresting officer has compromised these proceedings. Mr. Thompson, she addressed the teenage defendant directly. You and your counsel are free to go. We'll reconvene tomorrow at a.m. The public defender quickly gathered his papers, relief evident on his face. Thank you, Your Honor. As the defendant was escorted out, Wright noticed something in the boy's posture, a subtle straightening of the shoulders, a lifting of the chin. For perhaps the first time in his young life, he'd witnessed someone in authority being held accountable for their actions. The impact of that moment would likely stay with him far longer than any lecture on the consequences of vandalism. After the courtroom cleared, Wright remained seated at the bench for several minutes, allowing the gravity of what had just occurred to settle. This wasn't merely about punishing Cain for his actions. What had happened in this courtroom was the tip of an iceberg, a momentary glimpse at the vast hidden mass of corruption and abuse that had been allowed to flourish unchecked for decades. She knew what would come next. The system would attempt to close ranks. There would be pressure to handle this internally, to accept an apology, to consider Cain's service record. Powerful people would suddenly develop a keen interest in her career and future prospects. But Eleanor Wright hadn't become the first black female circuit judge in Charleston by backing down from fights that mattered. And this fight mattered more than most. The hallway outside Courtroom C buzzed with urgent whispers. Word traveled fast in courthouses, a microcosm where justice and gossip flowed along the same channels. By the time Judge Wright retreated to her chambers, the news had already begun to spread. Officer Kane had assaulted Judge Wright, and rather than managing it quietly, she was pursuing formal charges. In her private chambers, Wright finally allowed herself a moment of human reaction. She stood before the small mirror hanging near her door, examining the faint red mark on her left cheek. It would fade within hours, leaving no physical trace. But the impact of that moment would linger far longer for her, for Cain, and for a system that had grown too comfortable with its own corruption. How many people, she wondered, had left this courthouse with worse marks not just on their skin, but on their lives, their dignity, their faith in justice? How many had been silenced, intimidated, dismissed? How many had heard the message over and over, You don't matter. Your pain doesn't count. Your truth will not be believed. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Officer Martin entered, his usual stoic expression edged with something like satisfaction. They've taken him to holding room B, Martin reported. Internal Affairs has been notified. 2 agents are on their way, ETA 30 minutes. Wright nodded. Thank you, Martin. Any response from the department yet? Nothing official. Martin replied carefully. But word is Cain's union rep is already making calls. Of course they are, Wright said. She moved to her desk and pulled out a yellow legal pad. In clear architectural handwriting, she began listing. Incident: courtroom assault. Status: on record. Witnesses: 11 present. Cameras active. Officer's record: 17 complaints in 15 years. Last 5 complaints dismissed by. She circled the question mark, then added, request review of all dismissed complaints against Cain. Last 10 years, Martin watched her methodically documenting, his respect for her evident. They'll try to bury this, he said quietly. Wright looked up, her expression resolute. Then we'd better dig faster. 27 minutes later, 2 Internal Affairs agents arrived at Judge Wright's chambers. Agent Rosa Jackson was a no-nonsense black woman in her 40s with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen every trick in the book. Beside her stood Agent Miguel Alvarez, younger, but with an intensity that suggested he'd earned his position through more than just time served. Judge Wright, Jackson greeted her formally. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, Wright nodded. So do I, Agent Jackson. Please sit. As they settled around her conference table, Wright noticed the thick file Jackson placed between them. The tab read, Cain, Richard J. You've been watching him, Wright observed. Jackson nodded. For some time. But he's been. She searched for the right word, elusive, Wright repeated. An interesting choice of words for an officer with 17 formal complaints. 17 that were filed, Alvarez added. We suspect there are others who never came forward. Why? Wright asked, though she already knew the answer. Fear, Jackson said simply. Cain has protectors. Powerful ones. Cases disappear. Evidence goes missing. Witnesses suddenly can't remember what happened, and body cam footage. Wright pressed. Technical malfunctions, Alvarez replied, his tone making clear his skepticism. Remarkable how often equipment fails around Officer Kane. Wright leaned forward. I want names. Who's been protecting him? Jackson hesitated, just for a moment, then opened the file. This is where it gets complicated, Your Honor. She slid a document across the table. Wright scanned it, then felt her breath catch. It was an internal review from 3 years prior, a complaint alleging that Cain had beaten a teenage suspect during an arrest. The complaint had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence and contradictory witness statements. The reviewing officer who'd signed off on the dismissal, Captain Michael Whitaker. Whitaker, Wright said, Cain's former training officer and godfather to Cain's oldest son, Alvarez added. Wright continued reading, then stopped at another signature near the bottom of the page. Her eyes narrowed. District Attorney Eric Preston. Jackson nodded grimly. Preston has been the prosecutor on 27 of Cain's arrests in the past 5 years. The conviction rate is nearly perfect, 96%. That's statistically improbable, even for solid cases. Because they're not solid cases, Wright deduced. They're manufactured. Or coerced. We believe so, Jackson confirmed. But proving it has been nearly impossible. The network is tight. Information doesn't leak. Wright turned to the next document in the file and froze. It was a transcript from a surveillance recording, dated 18 months prior. Cain's voice was quoted verbatim, speaking in what appeared to be the police locker room. "You ever see her up close? That judge writes something. Walks around like she owns the courthouse. Thinks the robe makes her bulletproof." Another voice, unidentified. "She ever come after you?" Cain's response, "Let her try. I've got friends higher than her. She steps too far out of line. I swear she'll never even make it to the bench." One complaint, and poof, activist judge out the door. Wright looked up from the transcript, her expression unreadable. "How long have you had this?" "It was buried in a separate investigation," Jackson admitted. "Flagged as non-priority. We only found it after your clerk called about today's incident." And the second voice, Wright asked, "Still working on voice analysis," Alvarez said. "But preliminary matching suggests it might be Preston." Wright sat back, the full scope of what they were dealing with beginning to crystallize. This wasn't just about a cop with anger issues or even a corrupt prosecutor. This was systemic, a network of power and protection that reached into every corner of Charleston's justice system. "Judge Wright," Jackson said carefully, "there's something else you should know. There was an emergency meeting at the DA's office last night." Wright raised an eyebrow. "Last night? Before the incident with Cain?" "Yes," Jackson confirmed. "We have a source who says they were discussing strategies to limit your influence on several upcoming cases, particularly those involving excessive force complaints. They were planning to move against me," Wright concluded. "And then Cain handed them the perfect opportunity. We believe they'll try to force your recusal from Cain's case," Alvarez said. "They'll claim you can't be impartial because you were the victim. And then they'll bury it," Wright finished. "Minor misconduct charge, early retirement, case closed," Jackson nodded. "That's their playbook." Wright rose and walked to the window, looking out at the city she'd served for more than 3 decades. Charleston spread before her, beautiful, historic, deeply flawed. She'd always known corruption existed, but this was different. This was organized, deliberate, entrenched. A machine designed not just to protect the powerful, but to systematically crush anyone who challenged them. She turned back to the agents. "I want every case where Cain was the arresting officer in the last decade pulled and reviewed. I want the names of every prosecutor who dismissed complaints against him. I want financial records, phone logs, everything." "That's a lot of paper to move," Jackson warned. "A lot of toes to step on." "Then we'd better get started," Wright replied. She picked up her phone. "I'm calling Judge Simmons in the federal court." This just became a federal matter. By p.m., Judge Wright's chambers had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Files covered every surface, timeline charts hung on walls, and a steady stream of court clerks delivered yet more documentation. Agent Jackson coordinated with federal counterparts by phone while Alvarez systematically worked through Cain's case history. Wright's desk phone rang. She checked the caller ID. "Charleston Police Department, Judge Wright." She answered. "Clara, it's Chief Nolan." His voice was deliberately casual, as if they were discussing lunch plans rather than a criminal assault by one of his officers. "Chief," she acknowledged coolly. "I assume you've seen the footage by now." A pause. "I have." Another pause longer. "I'm not calling to defend Cain," Nolan added hastily. "No," Wright replied. "You're calling to control the damage." Nolan didn't deny it. "Eleanor," he said, dropping formality, "you need to understand what you're stepping into. This isn't about one officer losing his temper. You're pulling on a thread that could tear the department apart." "That's precisely my intention," Wright said calmly. "I'm not your enemy here." Nolan insisted. "Your silence in the face of corruption made you complicit long ago, Chief." Nolan's tone sharpened. "Look, you want Cain to pay? Fine. He's a problem, and I won't shed tears if he goes down. But if you keep pulling in names, commanders, prosecutors, past leadership, you're going to cause a collapse that none of us can clean up." Wright's voice remained steady. "Then perhaps it's time we stopped trying to clean up and started rebuilding." The line went dead. Wright replaced the receiver gently, then looked up to find Martin and Jackson watching her. "That sounded like a threat wrapped in a peace offering," Martin observed. "It was," Wright confirmed. "They're scared." "Good." Her cell phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number. Your nephew still bikes home alone through Riverside Park, doesn't he? Beautiful route this time of year." Wright felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She handed the phone to Jackson, who read it, and immediately began typing on her own device. "I'll have protection on your nephew within 5 minutes, Jackson promised. "And we'll trace this number." Wright nodded, her face composed despite the turmoil inside. They were escalating faster than she'd anticipated, moving immediately to threats against her family, rather than just professional pressure. It confirmed her suspicions about how deep this network ran and how desperate they were to maintain control. "There's more," Alvarez called from across the room. He held up a document. "Last year, a journalist named Sarah Mitchell was investigating financial connections between the Police Benevolent Fund and several judges in the district. 2 days after she requested access to certain court records, her car went off Westbridge Road. Ruled an accident, case closed." "Let me guess," Wright said grimly. "Cain was among the responding officers, first on scene," Alvarez confirmed. The implications hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about corrupt cops covering up excessive force or prosecutors dismissing legitimate complaints. This was about silencing anyone who came too close to the truth by any means necessary. Wright made a decision. "I'm calling Judge Raymond at the federal courthouse. We need U.S. Marshals involved immediately for protection and for jurisdiction." She looked at Martin. "And I want my nephew picked up from school right now." Martin nodded and stepped out to make the arrangements. Across town, Richard Kane sat in an interview room at the precinct. Not officially detained, not yet, but voluntarily assisting internal affairs. The technical distinction meant nothing. He knew he was in trouble deeper than anything he'd faced before. The door opened, and a man Cain didn't recognize entered. Late 50s, expensive suit, the easy confidence of someone used to wielding power. "Who the hell are you?" Cain demanded. The man placed a folder on the table. "Someone with mutual interests. You've been useful to certain parties over the years, Officer Kane. Now you've become a liability." Cain leaned forward. "A liability? I gave everything to this department, which is why they haven't thrown you to the wolves." Yet the man's voice was clinical, detached. "But understand this. If you allow Judge Wright to control the narrative, we will not protect you." "What do you want me to do?" Cain asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The man opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Judge Wright's home, her car, her daily routine. One showed her nephew on his bicycle. "Remind her of the natural order," the man said simply. "She needs to understand that power doesn't come from courtrooms or legal arguments. It comes from fear." Cain stared at the photos, a mix of emotions crossing his face. Even for him, this was crossing a line he'd previously only approached. "If I do this," he said slowly, "what do I get?" "A path that keeps you out of federal prison," the man replied. "A comfortable position with a private security firm that never asks questions about its employees' past." He paused. "Or you can take your chances with Judge Wright and the federal investigation she's about to trigger." After the man left, Cain sat alone, staring at the photographs. He'd spent his entire career believing he was untouchable, that the system would always protect him. Now he was being offered one last chance at protection, but at a cost that even he found disturbing. His hand hovered over the phone the man had left behind. One call and the machine would whir into action, the same machine that had protected him for years. But this time, it wouldn't be aimed at some random civilian or a suspected criminal. It would be targeted at a federal judge and her family. Cain picked up the phone. Back at the courthouse, the day was winding down, but activity in Judge Wright's chambers continued unabated. U.S. Marshal Daniel Rodriguez had arrived with 2 deputies, establishing security protocols for Wright and her family members. Agent Jackson coordinated with tech specialists tracing the threatening message. Wright stood at her window again, watching as the sun began to set over Charleston. The golden light bathed the historic buildings in a glow that belied the darkness she was uncovering within them. She thought about her nephew safely with federal protection now, and all the children in Charleston who didn't have such protection, who faced officers like Cain every day with no recourse, no justice, no shield. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from an unknown number. Judges should stay in courtrooms, not poke into matters beyond their understanding. Some investigations can be hazardous to your health. Wright handed the phone to Marshal Rodriguez without comment. He read it, face grim. They're escalating, he noted. Yes, Wright agreed. Because they're running out of options. By a.m. the next morning, the courthouse buzzed with nervous energy. Journalists clustered in the lobby. Court officers spoke in hushed tones, and attorneys arrived early, sensing that something momentous was unfolding. In Judge Wright's chambers, a new visitor waited. Elliot Parrish, young white, in an impeccable gray suit, with a state ethics board credential hanging from his lapel. Beside him sat District Attorney Eric Preston, stone-faced and rigid. Judge Wright. Parrish greeted her with a tight smile as she entered. Thank you for meeting us before court hours. Wright nodded coolly, taking her seat. Mr. Parrish. Mr. Preston. She didn't offer coffee. We've received a formal request from the DA's office. Parrish began, regarding your recusal from any matters involving Officer Richard Kane. On what grounds? Wright asked, though she already knew. Preston cleared his throat. Conflict of interest, Your Honor. You are the victim in an alleged assault by Officer Kane. State judicial code is clear that judges must recuse themselves from cases where their impartiality might reasonably be questioned. I'm familiar with the code, Mr. Preston, Wright replied evenly. Just as I'm familiar with your office's pattern of dismissing excessive force complaints against certain officers. Preston's jaw tightened. That's an inappropriate accusation. Is it? Wright opened a folder on her desk. Because I have documentation of 5 separate incidents where your office declined to prosecute Officer Kane, despite compelling evidence and multiple witnesses. Curious pattern, wouldn't you say? Parrish shifted uncomfortably. Judge Wright, we're here to discuss your recusal, not past cases. They're inseparable, Wright replied. The attempt to remove me from this case is not about impartiality. It's about continuing a pattern of protection and obstruction that has existed for years. She stood. Nevertheless, I will recuse myself from presiding over Kane's criminal case. Relief flickered briefly across Preston's face. However, Wright continued, I am requesting a public hearing regarding this recusal. I want the press present, and I want the record to show that my decision is based not on inability to be impartial, but on my determination to ensure this case receives the fullest possible scrutiny. Preston's relief vanished. That's highly irregular. So is assaulting a judge in her own courtroom, Wright replied. The hearing will be in Courtroom A at a.m. I suggest you both prepare accordingly. At a.m. sharp, Courtroom A was packed beyond capacity. Journalists filled the back rows, legal observers crowded the gallery, and a palpable tension filled the air. Judge Wright entered without her robes, making it clear she was not presiding but participating in the proceedings. Judge Samuel Washington, a respected senior judge, presided instead. This hearing concerns the voluntary recusal of Judge Eleanor Wright from criminal matters involving Officer Richard Kane. Judge Washington began. Judge Wright has requested this hearing be public. Objections? Preston rose. Your Honor, matters of judicial assignment are typically handled administratively, not in public forum. Typically, Judge Washington agreed. These matters don't involve judges being physically assaulted in their courtrooms. Objection overruled. Judge Wright, you may proceed. Wright approached the podium. Thank you, Your Honor. I want the record to show that I am voluntarily recusing myself from Officer Kane's criminal prosecution, not because I cannot be impartial, but because I refuse to allow procedural objections to distract from the substance of this case. She turned slightly, addressing both the court and the press directly. I have reviewed the arguments filed by the district attorney's office, claiming I am emotionally compromised. This language is telling. It suggests that a judge who experiences criminal assault should be disqualified from upholding the law, rather than particularly motivated to ensure it is properly applied. Preston shifted in his seat, but remained silent. More importantly, Wright continued, my investigation into this incident has revealed disturbing patterns that extend far beyond Officer Kane. She placed a document on the evidence table. This file contains evidence that Officer Kane's history of misconduct has been systematically concealed through a network of officials including, but not limited to, members of the district attorney's office. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Washington gavelled for silence. These are serious allegations, Judge Wright, Washington noted. Do you have substantiation? Indeed, Wright nodded to Agent Jackson, who approached with additional files. Internal Affairs has documented at least 7 instances where complaints against Officer Kane were dismissed despite compelling evidence. In 5 of those cases, District Attorney Preston personally declined prosecution. She placed another document on the table. Additionally, financial records show a $20,000 contribution to the state judicial endowment from an entity linked to the Charleston Police Benevolent Fund. Half of that money was later diverted to a legal defense fund that represented Officer Kane in a civil suit last year. Parrish, the ethics board representative, had gone pale. Judge Wright, these allegations go far beyond the scope of a recusal hearing. They go to the heart of why recusal is being demanded, Wright countered. This isn't about protecting the integrity of the judicial process. It's about containing damage and continuing a cover-up that has persisted for years. She turned to Preston. Tell me, Mr. Preston, who protected Officer Kane when body camera footage disappeared in 2019? The incident where a 17-year-old boy ended up in the hospital with 3 broken ribs and a concussion. Preston's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking. Agent Jackson stepped forward. We believe the footage wasn't lost, Your Honor. It was redirected. Wright raised an eyebrow. Redirected where? Jackson slid a document across the table. To an external server owned by a private security contractor based in Atlanta. That contractor has a retainer agreement with the Charleston mayor's office. And who approved that contract? Wright asked, though she already suspected the answer. All eyes turned to Preston. He remained silent, but his face told the story. You did, Jackson said, delivering the final blow. The courtroom erupted. Journalists were on their feet, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions and exclamations. Judge Washington banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Preston stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. This is character assassination. This is exposure, Wright replied calmly. And it's long overdue, Parrish from the ethics board rose as well, visibly shaken. I need time to process this information. These allegations are extremely serious. You'll have time, Wright assured him. But let the record reflect that I am voluntarily recusing myself to protect the process, not because I was pressured or intimidated, and certainly not because I intend to remain silent. She turned to address the reporters directly, her voice resonating through the now hushed courtroom. This city has protected a system of unchecked power for far too long. Today is not about a slap. It's about what happens when someone believes they can act without consequence, because every layer above them is willing to look the other way. She fixed Preston with a steady gaze. Those layers are crumbling, Mr. Preston. Justice may be slow, but it is persistent. Preston left the courtroom in a flurry of whispered phone calls and barely concealed panic. Parrish followed, already on his cell phone. Wright turned to Jackson and Martin, allowing herself a small sigh of relief. You think they'll come after you now? Martin asked quietly. Wright didn't hesitate. They already have. Her phone buzzed with a new message. Back off now, or the next target won't be you. She showed the screen to Jackson, who read it grimly. Good, the agent said. It means we're hitting nerves. Wright looked out the courtroom windows toward the sprawl of government buildings beyond. Somewhere in that maze of power, someone was watching, calculating, planning. She wasn't just trying to prosecute one corrupt officer anymore. She was challenging a machine built over generations to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. And that machine was beginning to fight back. The federal building in downtown Charleston stood in stark contrast to the ornate courthouse, all clean lines, bulletproof glass, and modern security. No columns, no historical plaques, no nods to a complicated past. Just the clear, unambiguous presence of federal authority. Judge Wright sat in a conference room on the 4th floor, facing 3 U.S. Marshals and 2 Department of Justice officials. She slid the threatening text messages across the table, along with a photograph that had been delivered to her office that morning, her nephew on his bicycle, taken without his knowledge or consent. On the back, scrawled in block letters, "Stay in your lane." We have reason to believe Officer Kane is behind these threats, Wright explained calmly, though likely acting on behalf of others. Marshal Rodriguez, a veteran with salt and pepper hair and the steady demeanor of someone who'd seen it all, examined the evidence without expression. You're certain it's him? I'm certain it comes from the same network that's been protecting him for years, Wright replied. Cain doesn't operate alone. He never has. Francis Quinn, the Dodge representative, leaned forward. What exactly are you asking for, Judge Wright? 3 things, Wright said without hesitation. Full federal protection for my family, immediate federal custody for Officer Kane, and an emergency judicial order freezing every case tied to his testimony for independent review. Quinn's eyebrows rose slightly. That's going to shake Charleston's judicial system for months. Wright met her gaze unflinchingly. Then let it shake. No one argued. Within an hour, a team of marshals was dispatched to locate and detain Cain, while others established protection details for Wright's family members. Wright herself returned to the courthouse, not as a judge behind the bench, but as a force moving through its halls with renewed purpose. She met Agent Jackson outside the district records room, where a team of clerks was already pulling files. We traced the burner phone, Jackson reported. Cain used it twice last night. One call went to a number registered to a shell company in Atlanta. The same one connected to the missing body cam footage. Wright asked. Jackson nodded. The same. And that company shares office space with a lobbying firm tied to your mayor's re-election campaign. Wright exhaled sharply. So the corruption extends beyond the courts and police. It reaches into city government. Way beyond, Jackson confirmed. "We're finding connections to construction contracts, zoning decisions, even school board appointments. This isn't just about protecting bad cops. It's about controlling the entire city." Wright lowered her voice. "The shell company, has it been flagged before?" "Twice," Jackson replied grimly. "First in a corruption probe 3 years ago that was mysteriously shut down. And again 6 weeks ago when a local journalist named Sarah Mitchell started asking questions." She paused. "Mitchell was found dead in her car 4 days later. Ruled an overdose." "Let me guess," Wright said, jaw tightening. "She had no history of drug use." "None," Jackson confirmed. "What she did have was a history of exposing corrupt officials. And she was getting close to something big." Wright's resolve hardened. "Find me everything that journalist was working on, every source, every file. If she was pulling on a thread, we're going to keep pulling until the whole tapestry unravels." Jackson hesitated. "Judge, this may go far beyond Cain." Wright's eyes flashed with determination. "I'm counting on it." Across the city, Richard Kane sat behind the wheel of an unmarked sedan, knuckles white with tension. He hadn't slept. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from unknown numbers, some offering help if he played his part, others warning him he was now expendable. The photograph of Wright's nephew burned a hole in his pocket. He'd crossed lines before, but always with the security of the badge, always with the protection of the system. This was different. This was nakedly criminal, and for the first time, he wasn't sure the system could protect him. He pulled into a downtown parking garage, mind racing. From the trunk, he retrieved a duffel bag cache, a second burner phone, and a gun that wasn't department issued. He wasn't going down without options. But as he turned toward the stairwell, a voice echoed through the concrete structure. Officer Kane, for U.S. Marshals, stepped from the shadows, weapons drawn but not aimed directly at him. Federal Marshals. "Put down the bag and step away from the vehicle." For a split second, Kane considered his options. But looking into the calm, professional faces of the Marshals, he recognized the truth. There would be no escape, no rescue, no backroom deal to make this disappear. For the first time in his career, Richard Kane surrendered without resistance. Back at the courthouse, Wright received confirmation of Kane's arrest. He was in federal custody, unarmed, and cooperating at least preliminarily. But her focus had already expanded beyond Cain to the network that had enabled him. She sat in conference with Jackson Martin and Dodge Representative Quinn, reviewing the expanding web of connections they were uncovering. "We've reopened the Sarah Mitchell case," Quinn reported. "Initial toxicology was inconclusive, but someone altered the medical examiner's report after submission. The digital signature on the changes came from a terminal that no longer exists in the system. Someone with administrative access," Wright observed. "How high does this go?" "We don't know yet," Quinn admitted. "But we've initiated a joint task force, internal affairs, federal investigators, and an external judicial review board. Cain is just the first thread we're pulling." Wright studied the files spread across her desk, names, cases, patterns forming a map of corruption that had festered for decades. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse steps below. People had gathered, their reporters, yes, but also community members, activists, families of those who had suffered under Cain and officers like him. Some held signs with his name. Others held photographs of loved ones whose cases had never found justice. Martin joined her at the window. "You did it," he said quietly. "No," Wright replied, her eyes still on the gathering below. "I just turned on the light." The roaches scattered themselves. She turned back to the room, her resolve unwavering. Now we see how deep the tunnel goes. And deep it would go. Because Richard Kane wasn't the only one facing justice now. The entire system that had protected him, judges, prosecutors, police commanders, politicians, was about to face a reckoning decades in the making. Eleanor Wright had not set out to dismantle an empire. She had simply refused to be silenced after being struck by a man who thought she didn't matter. But in that refusal, she had ignited something unstoppable, the slow, grinding wheels of genuine justice turning at last. The press conference was scheduled for a.m., but by 9:30, the front steps of the Charleston courthouse were already packed. Local news crews jostled with national correspondents. Legal observers stood shoulder to shoulder with community activists. Citizens held signs reading, "Justice for all" or "Justice for none," and the system didn't protect us. Judge Wright did. Inside her chambers, Judge Wright stood at the edge of the window, watching it unfold. She wore a tailored black blazer over a charcoal blouse, no robes today. This wasn't about her title or position. This was about her role as a citizen demanding accountability. "Cain's been moved to a secure federal facility," Jackson reported from behind her. "And he's talking." Wright turned. "To whom?" "Dodge agents." "He's naming names." "How many?" Jackson handed her a list. Wright scanned it, her expression unchanging until she reached one name that made her throat tighten: Judge Benjamin Howard. Howard had been her mentor during law school, had guided her early career, had publicly championed her appointment to the bench. He'd called her the future of Charleston justice at her swearing-in ceremony. "Ben," she whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than she'd expected. Martin, who stood nearby reviewing security protocols, looked over her shoulder at the list. "That man swore you in," he said, his disgust evident. Jackson was gentle but direct. "Howard signed off on at least 3 questionable case dismissals tied to Cain. One involved a civil rights complaint that disappeared before it hit a hearing." Wright's hands tightened into fists. "This goes deeper than crooked cops," she said. "This is institutional, judicial, political, generational." Jackson nodded grimly. "The kind of network that survives by feeding off silence." "Then we make noise," Wright declared, straightening her shoulders. "Starting now." Outside, the crowd fell silent as Wright emerged at the podium. Camera flashes erupted, but she didn't flinch. She looked out over the gathered crowd, not just at the press or officials, but at the ordinary citizens of Charleston who had lived under the shadow of corruption for too long. "I became a judge because I believed in the promise of justice," she began, her voice clear and resolute. "But promises mean nothing if they are not kept. Today, I stand not just as a member of the court, but as a witness to what has been broken and what must be rebuilt." She held up a document folder. "This contains the names of 12 individuals who, over the last decade, colluded to protect one another while abusing their authority. Some are police officers. Some are prosecutors. One is a sitting judge." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked frantically. "I have submitted this list to federal investigators," Wright continued. "I will not read these names aloud here, not because I fear backlash, but because I believe in due process, something many of them denied to others." Her voice grew stronger. "We are not here because of one man's slap. We are here because of what that slap revealed: a system built on fear, silence, and loyalty to everything but the truth." From the back of the crowd, someone called out, "We believe you, Judge Wright." Applause erupted, scattered at first, then swelling. Martin stood just behind her left shoulder, stone-faced but proud. Jackson lingered near the crowd, eyes scanning constantly for threats, because now that the names were public, Wright had painted a target on her back. And someone was already taking aim. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and the streets quieted, Wright returned to her chambers to gather her things. Her phone buzzed a voicemail from a blocked number. She pressed play. Eleanor. The voice was smooth, refined, instantly recognizable. Judge Benjamin Howard. I imagine by now you've seen my name on one of those lists, and I imagine you're feeling betrayed. But before you commit to the destruction of everything we've built, understand this. Some structures survive because they must. You take us all down. You take down the last bit of order this city has. Walk away while you still have that option, or you won't just lose your seat. You'll lose everything. The line went dead. Martin entered as she lowered the phone. Did I just see a black SUV pull away from the loading dock? Wright looked at him steadily. Howard just called me. Martin's face hardened. Threatening you? Warning me, Wright corrected. Which is worse, you're not backing down. Double quotes. It wasn't a question, but Wright answered anyway. Not a chance. By midnight, the counterattack had begun. The first smear article appeared online. Judge Wright, accused of improper conduct during 2009 case. No sources, no evidence, just innuendo and manufactured outrage. Then came the social media assault, sudden floods of posts with like #activist judge and #Wright must resign. An old photograph surfaced, Wright at a civil rights protest during her college years, fist raised. The caption twisted it into something sinister, radical. Even her nephew's school received a call from a concerned citizen asking whether the boy was being indoctrinated with anti-police sentiment at home. They weren't just attacking her professionally. They were trying to destroy her personally, to isolate her, to make her toxic to anyone who might support her. Wright sat in her home office, scrolling through the digital onslaught with Martin and Agent Jackson. They're trying to discredit everything, Martin observed grimly. Burn your reputation, your legacy, your future. Wright nodded calmly, then stood and walked to her desk. From the bottom drawer, she pulled a black leather binder and handed it to Martin. What's this? He asked. Everything I've never said aloud about Howard, about cases that didn't feel right, about whispers I heard at bar association dinners and judicial conferences. Every suspicion, every inconsistency, every red flag I've noticed in 15 years on the bench. Martin flipped through the pages, eyes widening. You documented all of this? Of course I did, Wright replied simply. I'm a judge. Documentation is survival. He continued scanning the contents. Eleanor, this isn't just a defense. This is a nuclear weapon. I'm not trying to survive anymore, she said, her voice soft but resolute. I'm going to make sure they can never hide again. As the city slept, evidence was secured, allies were contacted, and protective measures were implemented. In her quiet home office, Judge Eleanor Wright prepared for the final phase of this unwanted but necessary war, not against a man, but against the very machine that had created him and countless others like him. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse downtown buzzed with tension. The building had been under heightened security. Since dawn, a perimeter of U.S. Marshals surrounded the entrance. Protesters and supporters filled the plaza, and news crews broadcast live from designated areas. Inside, the main courtroom was standing room only for the trial of Richard Kane. The charges were severe: assault of a federal judge, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to suppress evidence, witness intimidation, and perjury, 5 felony counts that could send him to prison for decades. But Cain wasn't the only one facing judgment. Behind closed doors across the city, indictments had been unsealed, resignations tendered, plea deals negotiated. District Attorney Eric Preston had resigned in disgrace. Judge Benjamin Howard was suspended pending judicial investigation. 2 police captains had been fired. 3 officers had turned state's evidence. And the mysterious facilitator who had approached Cain in detention, the unnamed handler, who had delivered threats and promised protection had vanished, leaving only digital breadcrumbs that federal investigators were following relentlessly. The web was unraveling. And at the center of it all sat Judge Eleanor Wright, not on the bench, but in the front row of the gallery, a witness to the justice she had demanded. Cain sat at the defense table, shoulders slumped, the arrogance drained from his posture. He looked older, diminished. Occasionally, his eyes would drift to Wright, not with hatred now, but with the hollow recognition of a man who finally understood the cost of his actions. U.S. Attorney Margaret Chen rose to call her first witness. The United States calls Judge Eleanor Wright. To the stand, Wright moved forward with measured steps, took her oath, and settled into the witness chair. The courtroom held its collective breath. Judge Wright, Chen began. Could you please tell the court what happened on the morning of April 11th in Courtroom C of the Charleston County Courthouse? Wright's voice rang clear and steady. I was struck in the face by a man who believed I didn't belong. And what did that moment represent to you? Wright paused, considering the question carefully. It represented a system that had lost its way, a system where respect for law and human dignity had become conditional, reserved only for those who fit a certain mold. She looked across the courtroom, not at Cain, but at the jury. But it also meant something else, that silence could no longer protect us. That if I didn't stand up, others would stay down. No further questions, Chen said quietly. Cain's defense attorney approached, young and clearly outmatched. His cross-examination was halting, defensive. Judge Wright, do you think you're above the law? Wright looked at him as if he were a first-year law student who had missed the point of the entire lesson. No, she replied simply. I think I'm beneath it, like everyone else. That's the point. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney tried again. Do you admit that you brought personal bias into this investigation? I brought truth, Wright countered. And if that truth is uncomfortable, that's not bias. That's justice doing its job. The verdict came 2 days later, guilty on all counts. But Cain's fate was no longer the headline. The ripple effect had become a wave, then a tsunami. A week later, the governor announced a statewide investigation into judicial misconduct. More than 140 past convictions were placed under review. A civil rights commission began auditing police complaint procedures. The Charleston Police Department was placed under full federal oversight. And through it all, Judge Eleanor Wright continued her work not from the bench, but from within the joint task force she had helped create. She had become something more powerful than a judge. She had become a catalyst for genuine change. It was a rainy Thursday when she returned to Courtroom C, where it had all begun. The room was empty now, the day's proceedings finished. Wright stood before the bench, looking at the chair she had occupied for 15 years. Martin entered quietly, coat still damp from the rain. They want to name the judicial conference room after you, he said. Wright raised an eyebrow. I haven't died. Exactly, Martin replied with a hint of a smile. She turned serious again. Are the reforms going to stick? Martin shrugged. Some will. Others will take time and continued pressure. Wright nodded thoughtfully. That's what they never tell you about justice. It's not a moment. It's erosion and rebuilding, over and over again. She had made her decision. That afternoon, Wright stood before the State Judiciary Review Board, cameras rolling, microphones capturing every word. I am submitting my resignation, she announced, prompting gasps from the assembled officials and press. Not in defeat, but in recognition that true change requires new voices and perspectives. I believe in the law. I believe in its power to protect, to punish, and to heal. But I also believe that institutions must be rebuilt by new hands. I lit a fire. It is not for me to stand in its glow. A board member stood, visibly disturbed. Judge Wright, your actions have inspired a movement. You could remain and lead that change. Wright smiled sadly. Change doesn't need a monument, it needs momentum. She turned to leave, but not before offering one final thought. Make sure the next woman who wears this robe doesn't have to fight the way I did just to be heard. 2 months later, Eleanor Wright sat on the porch of her family home in the quiet Riverdale neighborhood. The humidity of late summer wrapped around the evening like a blanket, but a gentle breeze made it bearable. She rocked slowly in a chair that had belonged to her grandmother, watching as her nephew pedaled up the driveway, backpack bouncing against his back. He dropped his bike on the lawn and bounded up the steps. Aunt Eleanor. She rose to embrace him, holding him close for a moment longer than usual. In the weeks since her resignation, she had rediscovered the simple pleasure of being present for her family, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. How was school? She asked as they settled into porch chairs. Good. We're studying civil rights history, he replied. Miss Jackson mentioned you today. Wright raised an eyebrow. Did she? She said sometimes change doesn't come from big movements, but from one person who refuses to accept injustice. He looked at her with the unfiltered admiration only a child can offer. She was talking about you, wasn't she? Wright smiled softly. She was talking about all of us who choose to stand up, even when it's difficult. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set. In the distance, the city lights of Charleston began to twinkle on one by one. The city was changing slowly, unevenly, with resistance and setbacks, but changing nonetheless. The federal investigation had expanded beyond Charleston to other jurisdictions in the state. 3 judges had resigned. 5 police officers faced criminal charges. The mayor had announced he wouldn't seek re-election. New policies for body cameras, complaint procedures, and use of force had been implemented under federal oversight. But perhaps most importantly, people were speaking up. Complaints that would have been buried months ago were being properly investigated. Community oversight boards had real power. Young lawyers were rejecting the old patronage systems. The silence that had protected corruption for generations was finally breaking. Do you miss being a judge? Her nephew asked suddenly. Wright considered the question carefully. I miss the opportunity to directly apply the law, fairly. But I don't miss the constraints of the role. Will you go back? She shook her head. No, I've accepted a position teaching ethics at the law school, and I'm writing a book about judicial reform. Her nephew nodded, satisfied with her answer. As darkness settled around them, Wright reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A single moment of violence had sparked a transformation that neither she nor her attacker could have predicted. It wasn't revenge that had driven her. It was a bone-deep belief that systems could be better, that justice delayed need not be justice denied, that truth had power when spoken aloud. This wasn't just a courtroom drama about a racist cop who slapped the wrong judge. This was a mirror held up to American society, a reflection of power, prejudice, and the price of silence. But it was also a reminder that no matter how entrenched corruption might seem, it remains vulnerable to one thing: courage. Judge Eleanor Wright had spent her career interpreting the law, but her legacy would be teaching others how to change it, for the systems that oppress us are not natural disasters beyond our control. They are human constructions. And what humans build, humans can rebuild. That is the true power of justice, not in its punishment, but in its possibility.